North Country Public Radio will soon be working with other New York public news stations to create a statewide public news network. The newly conceived New York Public News Network was announced by the radio station earlier this month. NCPR station manager David Sommerstein says by coordinating stories from across the state with different stations, residents of the North Country will get more in-depth coverage on statewide events without having to change to different stations.
We know that listeners are really interested in what's going on around the state. People have family there. People have, connections. People have work in those places, and so they'll wanna. And so people want to know what's going on in those communities.
Around a dozen stations are set to be a part of the statewide radio network, from as far north as Messina to as far south as Montauk.